about the government and how our attitude towards the government needs to be manifest in our Christianity, in the way we talk about it, as well as in the way we act. And as a, not really a tangent to that, I suppose, but as a somewhat connected concept is our attitude towards church government. And it was brought really near to my attention this last week because I received a copy of the obituary for Mr. Lambert as I was performing his funeral. And they sent me the obituary, and as soon as they sent it to me, I was dreading what I was going to find, the title that was going to be before my name. And it was Reverend Chris Reno is performing the funeral. And I always forget to mention, it's just Chris, right? And even when I was there, they kept calling me Reverend. And the funeral home, and it's not an uncommon thing. It happens all the time. It's a bit frustrating, but it comes from this idea, and it originates or is derived from the misconception of the hierarchy as it's established in the Bible. And so they use the word Reverend, and then I told him, just Chris, right? And the next time he sees me walking around, it's now Pastor Chris. And I'm like, no, maybe I can make this clear. It's just Chris. My name's Chris. Just call me Chris. And it doesn't ever do anything. It doesn't ever go anywhere. And then it just gets back to Reverend or Pastor. And I don't know entirely why, but I suspect strongly that it's not only derived from this misconception, but is then therefore encouraged in order to gain power into individuals or the specific groups that folks mean it to be in. One of the easiest ways of controlling a congregation is to have one person over that congregation and control that one person. If you had a larger group of people, 2 or 3 in plurality anyway, it would be harder to control those group of people. And so having a pastor, having a reverend, having someone that's over the congregation by, say, some outside group of people that was at some other location that was able to control multiple places, it would be a lot easier to do that with one person rather than a group. God didn't create the system that way, as we'll see in the near future. God created the system so that regardless of how any one individual congregation or those group of men or women who make decisions for the whole of their religious organization, no matter how they waver scripturally, individual congregations don't fall to false teaching. It's incredibly powerful the way God created the system, and it's incredibly, as you look forward into it and as you see it play out, sometimes it makes absolute sense. Now that doesn't give it credence at all. God decides things, whether it makes sense to Chris or not. But there are times where God makes a decision, and at first I was a little like, that's not how that's got to work, right? Because I came from a denominational background. And then the more I see it, and the more I see it work, and the more I see the problems in the denominational world, the more I'm like, that God knew what he was doing. Go figure, right? God knew what he was doing. And it's important when we talk about church government, people immediately head to the elders, and that's not the place we should ever start. In fact, the first point on my list here, as you see here, is the head is not the elders, the head is Christ. Right? The head is always going to be Christ, or it's not the church. If Christ is ever anything but the head, you don't have the church at all. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3, Paul's going to talk about gender roles. Interestingly enough, we're not going to go fully into Paul's discussion here tonight. We might in the near future, but Paul's going to talk about gender roles and some of the aspects of the gender roles that were there both in Corinth and overall. But for now, there in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3, he begins this discussion with verse 3. He says, "But I want you to know." Now, whenever anyone says that, whenever one leads into something they're going to talk about and they start with, "I want you to know," and something else that Paul says all the time, "I do not want you to be ignorant," which is the opposite of this, right? It's basically the same thing being said in 2 different directions. I don't want you to be ignorant is the same thing as saying I want you to know. I want you to understand this one point most specifically because it ties into everything else I'm going to talk about, and hence I'm going to begin with it here. I, as well as Paul, do not want you to be unaware of. We want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of woman is man, Christ is God. That is incredibly important, and it cannot be understated. The number of times Paul points right back to that very point. Paul is a man. He is not the head of the church. Peter is a man. He is not the head of the church. Christ is the head of the church. But even Christ has someone, in that sense, that's over him, the Father. As Jesus was even on the earth, he deferred regularly to the Father. He regularly, constantly, he prays to the Father for various things. He is in support of the Father's plan. He enacts that plan through his life and his very death on the cross. And it's important to recognize that while Christ is the head of the church, the head of Christ, he says there is God. Everyone has someone that's over them. And no one is exempt from that in that sense. No one on the earth is exempt from that concept. If we turn over in 1 Samuel chapter 15, 1 Samuel chapter 15, a story probably many of you are fairly well aware of. 1 Samuel chapter 15. This isn't the first mistake Saul has made, but it is one of the last he's going to make before God makes a decision. He's already warned him that he is going to take the kingship away from him. But here in 1 Samuel 15, Saul, he is charged with something. He is supposed to do something. He is supposed to go and he is supposed to fight the Amalekites. And after he fights them, and the assumption is just you're going to be victorious, wipe them out entirely, and it's going to work if he would follow through with it. And you need to kill everything, including the king himself. Everything needs to die. And this wasn't uncommon for the Israelites to be responsible for. That was the very premise of them coming into the land, that they would either run out or destroy all of the individuals of the tribes that were there at the time. This was a judgment. It wasn't just God deciding fickly that the people of the land needed to be run out because the Israelites need to be here. It was a judgment on the people at the time. And if you remember back to Genesis, Jeremiah, that's the wrong direction. If you remember back to Genesis and God talking to Abram concerning his people, that God was going to bring his people and make them multiply like the stars in the sky. He is going to bless them, but he is also going to take them into captivity for 390 years. And the reason he gives there is because the sins of the Amalekites are not yet full. It was not yet time to judge the peoples of the land, that they had not grown in their sin enough, though they would over the next approximately 400 years, to warrant his destroying them. This is not God being, again, fickle and wanting to remove them because he wants to move someone else in. You may have known landlords who would do that, right? They would throw you out so that somebody else could move in that they really want to move in. Well, that's not what God's doing. And just as much God wanting to bless the Israelites and give them this land, it is a condemnation of the people of the time and a judgment upon them. And in this case, Samuel has charged Saul with destroying the Amalekites. And what we find here in verse 17, if you pick up here in verse 17, so Samuel said, "When you were little in your own eyes, were you not head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel?" Did God not support you as king? Did God not give you exactly what he promised to give you and give you the opportunities to do? Have you not won great victories this time and against your enemies? Have you not set up a kingship? God has blessed you and provided for you, Saul. But what has happened is he has sent Saul away, and Saul has come back, and he tells Samuel, and it's incredible that he would do such a thing. He tells Samuel, "I have done all that the Lord has commanded me." And Samuel has this incredible line where he says, "Why do I hear sheep?" Oh, that, right? Oh, that. Well, you know how the people are, right? The people, they determined that we should bring it back and sacrifice it to God. And here in verse 18, notice what he says here now. "The Lord sent you on a mission and said, 'Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed.' Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord?" Now he could give any reason he liked. He could say, "Well, I was going to sacrifice it to God." He was going to say, "I was going to give it to the poor." He could say, all these things I thought were the right thing to do rather than what I was told to do. And Saul said to Samuel, but I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me, and brought back Agag, king of the Amalekites. I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. Now, see, he's using a different language. He's saying utterly destroyed as in, yeah, they're pretty much gone. Utterly destroyed is not the same as pretty much gone. Pretty much gone includes some exceptions to that. And God gave no exceptions. God gave no quarter. There were no exceptions made by God. He was to utterly destroy them. But Saul heard, pretty much take care of them. Right? Wipe most of them out. But that's not what God said. And look at verse 24. Verse 20. There you go. 21. There we go. But the people took the plunder, sheep and oxen, the best of the things, which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. So Samuel said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he also has rejected you from being king. To obey is better than sacrifice. There are a lot of people who struggle with that concept even today. A lot of people still struggle with that concept even to today. God sets the parameters. We like to have control. We like to exert control. There are times where you tell your child what to do, and they want to finish what they're doing before they do what you say. And if you tell them again, we have this problem with one of our children. She's the youngest. Well, now she's the second youngest, I guess. And she wants some level of control, right? That's all she wants. She wants to get her way just the tiniest bit. No. That's not how this works. You know? And that's the way we are with God. I'll do what you want, but I want the tiniest bit of control over it. Right? I want just the tiniest bit of my way first, and then I'll do what you want. No. You're going to do what I tell you to do because I am the head of this house. Or Trisha, I am the parent. I am the one you are supposed to listen to. And that's what God is telling Saul here. God's telling Saul, I'm the parent. Right? Samuel's telling God is the person you're supposed to listen to. It's not, again, this is crazy. It's not about you. And it's not about what you think is a better thing. Now, Saul may have very well thought that, hey, I can bring these animals back and sacrifice them to God. What God would have preferred is just obedience to begin with. He would have just preferred that you do what you're supposed to do. If your parent sends you to the store to buy meat, bread, and eggs, and you come home with meat, bread, eggs, and a candy bar, and you're offering to share it with them, that's not the same thing. And there is going to be a problem, or there should be in your household if that's what's happening. Obedience is better than sacrifice. Obey regardless. And I don't know if I can stress that enough. I know you all understand that, but it feels like the world around us, and even we sometimes, as a group of Christians, struggle with that concept. Obedience is better than sacrifice. And you look through the Old Testament. In Hebrews chapter 7, you could go to 1 Chronicles 15 to see it, but in Hebrews chapter 7, the Hebrews writer makes this incredible point concerning the Old Testament example. Hebrews chapter 7. If we start at verse 11, he says, therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek, and not be called according to the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed, of necessity there is also a change of the law. You can't change priesthoods without changing the law. You can't just walk into the law of Moses and adapt it however you darn well please. That's not how it works. It must be maintained in its entirety until it is absolved completely. That's the argument Jesus makes in Matthew 5. That not one jot or tittle, not even the smallest part of the old law was going to be done away, or was going to be destroyed. I came not to destroy the law and the prophets, not to destroy, but to fulfill, he says. It wasn't until the whole thing was fulfilled and taken out of the way that another covenant, and therefore another priesthood, and therefore another kingship could be established. So the old law, the Hebrews writer is arguing, could not be done away with until it was done away with entirely. You could modify it and change it and tweak it however you like. Verse 13, for he of whom these things are spoken, he's talking about Jesus, belongs to another tribe from which no man has officiated at the altar. You would say, well, how does that have anything to do with anything? Just because no one from the tribe of Judah, Jesus, has officiated at the altar as a priest, a Levitical priest, why does that matter? Couldn't he still do it? Wasn't he still allowed? Verse 14, for it is evident that our Lord arose from Judah, he just told us that, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning the priesthood. Now this is a bit of silent authority here, and that's an important point on its own, honestly, that people miss. God didn't have to tell everybody that people from Judah couldn't be priests. People from Benjamin couldn't be priests. People from Asher couldn't be priests. Gad couldn't be priests. All he had to do was say, hey, the priesthood comes from the Levites. That's all he had to say. And it excluded everything else. And they all understood that. Well, except for Micah. But that's a different story. Not the prophet, the guy from Judges, which is a huge mess. It's a real interesting story. You should read it. It's the end of the book of Judges. And he says, and it is yet far more evident if in the likeness of Melchizedek there arises another priest who has come not according to the law of the fleshly commandment, but according to the power of the endless life. This is that new priesthood that we've been talking about, honestly. God, in the Old Testament, the law of Moses, chose the Levites to be priests. Not all of them, technically. Technically, it's only a delineation of the Levites. It's a family of the group of Levites. Others had different jobs. Each of them had their own place in the world of the Israelites that they were supposed to function, and that was their job. God, through Jacob, Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, chose Judah to rule. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from in their midst. God, through Judah, prophesied that it would be God through Jacob prophesied that it would be Judah, the tribe of Judah, that the kingship would come through. And even though they started with Saul because he was a good example of a bad king, and it gave them a demonstration of what God wanted to give them. And then God begins the kingly line with David. And the kingly line travels through David until it's expunged at the end of the Israelite kingdom before the captivity. Exodus chapter 3, God, through the burning bush, chose Moses to lead. Now, why do I make these points? Why are we talking about this? Think about how the other people felt. And it's interesting because we don't have to speculate. We know how they felt. In Numbers chapter 16, we meet a few individuals, and it's sad that Korah gets the brunt of this, because he, as I've recently read, is not the only one involved in this. Korah is just the name that we all pick on, which it's fine to pick on him, I suppose, because he still makes a really, really poor choice. But in Numbers chapter 16, Korah decides as well, he says, Korah the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, with Dathan. So Dathan's in this too, so we can't just throw Korah under the bus. It's all of them. And Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men, he says, and they rose up before Moses with some of the children of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation, representatives of the congregation, men of renown. They gathered together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You take too much upon yourselves, for all the congregation is holy, every one of them." Now I want you to stop for a second. Have they said anything that's not technically true yet? Later on, Jethro is going to make the same argument to Moses. He's going to say, "Hey Moses, you're taking on way too much. You need to set up lower judges and individuals to judge for Israel." And Moses does that, right? He is still the person who's in charge. He's still the leader of the Israelites. But he delegates the situation, so he's not sitting at the judgment seat all day, every day, and still there's a line of people. That's not what they're talking about, though. All the people of the congregation are holy. That is also true. God was calling the Israelites to be holy as he is holy. The number of times that's talked about throughout the Old Testament, but even explicitly just in Exodus and Leviticus, the law was astounding. God talks about the holiness of himself, and by extension, the holiness of the people was expected. So what they're saying is not untrue. All of Israel was holy. They had been set apart. They had been drawn out of Egypt. And they had been kept in Egypt as an isolated group for a long time before even that. They were a holy people. And that's what God was calling from them. But that's not what they're talking about. What they're talking about is something entirely different. He says, you take too much upon yourselves, for all the congregation is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? From the outside, being Moses sounds like a great thing to do. From the inside, Moses would probably just as soon not do it. In fact, he tried to not do it back in Exodus 3 when God presented himself to Moses at the burning bush. He's like, well, I can't do that. I am not well spoken. I've got all these excuses for why I shouldn't be able to do that. And God said, tough nuggets, go do it. I'll give you Aaron. Here you go. That's your consolation prize for the day. And yet, everyone from the outside looks at Moses and they say, wow, Moses got it good. He is the leader of Israel. Why should Moses be the leader? Why can't I be the leader? And Moses is like, I wish you could be the leader. I wish somebody else could be the leader. And we're going to see that in the near future in other aspects as well. Everything looks great from the outside. The grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, in part because we have a hard time accepting what charge we have been given, what job we have been given, what part of the kingdom we have been given. For all the congregation is holy, every one of them. That's the argument they make, and I want you to remember that. For all the congregation is holy, every one of them. And then even the next chapter, after Korah and all those who support him die, ground opens up. God warns Moses and the people that are following Moses, get away from Korah and all of their tents. Ground opens up, swallows these people, closes back up again. All of them are dead. And even at the end of chapter 17, they're still upset. And they go to Moses, at the end of 16, they're still upset. And then God establishes that Aaron is his leader by having everyone bring a stick, a rod, and lay it all down, put your name on it, not your name, but the name of your tribe, on it, and you lay it down, and the one that buds, that's the guy I picked. And guess what? Aaron's rod buds. And then it gets put into the Ark of the Covenant to establish that God was with the people and God had chosen these individuals. God had chosen who was leader, and there was no questioning it. There was no challenging it, because you can't challenge it. It's like you can go up and you can file a complaint. There's no box for complaints for God, though they sure would have built one as much as they complained. That thing would have been full. So God, through the Old Testament, he establishes the leaders, and I think he did a pretty good job. Now, from the other perspective, would Aaron have liked to not be priest from time to time? I'm sure that's the case as well. I'm sure there are days that Aaron really wished he hadn't gotten involved in this whole process to begin with. Like the day his two sons died because they happened to get intoxicated, it seems. I don't mean to say it like that. That they go into the tabernacle and offer strange fire and are consumed from fire from heaven. I'm sure that was not a great day where Aaron appreciated being the priest. Because if he hadn't been high priest, his sons wouldn't have been anywhere near that, and they couldn't have gotten involved in something they ought not have done. So I'm sure Aaron has some bad days. Imagine, as we've talked about a number of times, that table of showbread where they're doing the Indiana Jones, trying to get the cakes on and the cakes off at the same time. And how stressful that would have been as the idea of this nonsense has carried forward over the years. Man, I wish somebody else would have to do this. But who's looking on the priesthood from the outside going, wow, Chuck's a priest. Man, I bet they've got it easy. They could kill a couple animals. You know how many animals they kill? That's a lot of animals. That's a lot of blood. That's a lot of nasty smells going on in the tabernacle that no one sees and no one deals with and no one cleans up except for the Levites, because that's their job. Everything's different on the other side. And so we go to the New Testament. 1 Timothy chapter 5. I almost said 15. That's too bad 1 Timothy doesn't have 15 chapters. That'd be awesome. 1 Timothy 5. In verse 17. All of those first 2 points, all to get to 3 points here. But they're really important points. There's some really important stuff here. And specifically verse 17 here, he says, "Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the laborer is worthy of his wages. Do not receive an accusation against the elder except from 2 or 3 witnesses." So there is a precedent for you to believe the elders because of not just because of their position, but because of why they were put in that position to begin with. Not just the authority that position yields them, but because of who they had to be in order to become an elder in the first place. And because they are in a position that is public, they will be targeted from time to time. He says, but then on the alternate side, verse 20, those who are sinning, so those 2 or 3 witnesses come forward and say, hey, this is happening, then you have to handle it. And the answer is not to sweep it under the rug, which is oftentimes the first instinct of any group of people with their leaders. Just sweep it under the rug, right? Deny, deny, deny. No, look at verse 20. Those who are sinning, rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest also may fear. They are not above contestation. That is challenging. They need to be challenged, in fact. If you find out that they are sinning, it needs to be dealt with publicly, at least in the congregation. I don't mean publicly outside with outsiders. I mean within the congregation. It's not something that gets dealt with immediately and quietly. You don't quiet it up. You don't solve the problem with money, which a lot of folks have done in the past. I don't just mean the church, I mean altogether. It needs to be handled in the presence of all, because no one is above the Lord. No one is above the head of the church. He says, I charge you before God and the rest of I charge you before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels that you observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing with partiality. He's going to go on to dealing with other people as well, but we don't need to deal with that for now. Look at 1 Timothy 3. I want you to notice verse 1 and 2, though you could keep going, and that would tell you the qualifications that an elder needs to have before they become an elder. But I want you to pick up here specifically verses 1 and 2. This is a faithful saying, which is one of those keys that Paul gives. It's like, I really want you to know this thing, or I don't want you to be ignorant. Now he's like, this is a faithful saying. This is something you can take to the bank, you might say. Better than take to the bank, because it's from God. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless. And the implication here is also must be the husband of one wife. Must be temperate, must be sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. And he's going to talk about these things. But look at verses 1 and 2. If a man, very specific in the Greek, if a man desires the position of a bishop, and the bishop must be the husband of one wife. Now, I don't care how you try to stretch this, Paul tells you exactly what an elder is biologically. Right? As far as their gender is concerned, they are male. And you can not like that, you can like that, it doesn't matter. God tells you, through Paul, what he expects the position of an elder to be held by, and that is a man. Now, there's a lot more than just, hey, any guy that happens to be in the body of Christ, or just any warm-bodied male to begin with. Anybody that has a pulse can serve in that capacity. No! But it is explicitly a male. Now, is that to say that men are going to do a better job than a woman could do? Not necessarily. And that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who's most competent or most capable of handling this. It matters only that God designated who would do that thing. That's all that matters. Did God picking Aaron mean that Aaron and all of his descendants for the foregone history of Israel, that they would all be the best candidates as high priest? No. Or that David's family would always be the best candidates time that could have potentially done it didn't matter. God established who would do it. And the same is for the eldership. He has to be the husband of one wife. It's hard for a woman to be the husband of one wife. It's hard for them to be a man. And that's the point. You might not like it. The world might not like it. The world might wish it were different. It doesn't matter. All that matters is that God designated who would do this thing, not whether there would be explicitly better at it than others or whatever the case might be. That doesn't matter. And we can argue until the cows come home, whatever that means. I don't know why the cows are gone. Maybe we should go get them. But the point is, it doesn't matter. And that's what we get hung up on. We get hung up on what makes sense to us, how we think things should be done. And in the Old Testament, when folks question those things, I'm not saying that the earth's going to open up and swallow people. It obviously hasn't for quite some time, but it did. And it did for much less than what a lot of people argue for. It is established easily. And if you look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8, you probably know where I'm going. I desire therefore that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. An additional concept here that he's going to bring in, both here and in other places, is simple male leadership in the congregation. Now, I have talked in the class, I forget, I was covering Trisha's class, and I forget what we were talking about. I think we were talking about appointing David, or no, it had been before that. Whatever, it doesn't matter. We were talking, and I had two young girls. I had Allie and Angelica in my class, and we were talking about leadership. And my point to them was that Deborah was chosen, it looks like, because there were no men who would do it. But notice she doesn't take an active role as judge or military leader. She still has the king at the time, and now I'm drawing a blank. But we were talking about it, and I was like, why do men lead? Why do men pray when there are men present, when men are capable of praying? Why do men lead singing? Why do men preach? Is it because they're intrinsically better at these things? No. Most women in the congregation would be better at singing if we're talking about sound quality or competency with music than me. The only reason that men lead in the churches of Christ is because God told us to. That's it. And it is not a degradation of your capability or to say that you are worse at it than we are. It is simply that God told us to do it. That's it. And that is enough. Needs to be enough for us as Christians, because God is the head of Christ and Christ is the head of man. And as Paul says, man is the head of woman. It's